So remember, this kind of goes back to Abraham's story, right? Abraham is given the promise that is eventually carried through and continued through his children, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob gives birth to his 12 sons, or his wives do, and they're the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. Things get all jacked up, and eventually Israel ends up enslaved to Egypt for 400 years. But this is the promise that they've literally been waiting on for 400 years. This promised land that was promised to Moses all the way back in Genesis. That this is the land. You're going to have all of the people will be blessed by you. This is what the people were looking forward to. This is what Moses would have been looking forward to. The promised land, the place that they were supposed to be delivered to. That they were going to go occupy the land that was promised to their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is what they would have been looking forward to. This is what they would have been wishing for the whole time they were in slavery. But you see, Moses knew something that Israel didn't. That the only reason the promised land was so holy was because of God's presence. That's the only reason. Moses knew that the true land of promise is wherever God was. It's wherever God was. That's where the promised land was. It was less about the actual acreage. It was less about the actual square footage of, okay, this is the borders of, the land of Canaan where the people of Israel are supposed to go. He didn't care about the land because if God wasn't going with them, he knew that they weren't going to be blessed. That's why he says, you're telling me to go, you're telling me to bring up these people to this place, but if you're not going with us, let's stay right here where you are. Moses, talking to God, says, isn't your presence what makes us different from the rest of the people? This is very true. The presence of God with us and in us is what distinguishes us, his people, from the rest of the world. Because of that, we need to long for the presence of God. Here's what I want you guys to know. So he cared more about where God's presence was than where he was going to be. And so how does this apply for us? Okay, let's just think about this practically a little bit. We need to be where God is. We need to be in his presence and care about being in his presence. And I've got some more points to get into about this, but let me just touch on this for a second. So, for example, all right, you come to church on a Sunday, you come to NRS on a Sunday, you have a Bible study or whatever. Guess what? Every time you come to church, the message is not for you, right? You're not going to get something like, I'm sure all of you right now, you're not getting something out of tonight's message, and that's okay. I hope you do. I hope there's at least a piece or two that you can gather, but every single time you come at church, you're not going to get something out of the message. Guess what? But the person sitting next to you, this might be the thing that's changing their life. This might be the very thing. So you don't come to church for a message. You don't come to church for worship. You don't come to church for community and fellowship. You come to church to meet with and encounter God. Okay? Now, how does that happen? You encounter God through a message. You can encounter God through worship. You can encounter God through community and fellowship. Of course, those are pathways into which we go into God's presence. But the thing that we're after isn't those things in and of themselves, because those things in and of themselves, apart from the presence of God, mean nothing. They mean nothing. They are pointless. They won't lead you to blessing, because it's God's presence that makes those things worth something. Are you catching what I'm saying here? And so, God's presence is the thing that distinguishes church from other places of gathering, right? We talked about this in our series at the I think it was the beginning of 2025, right? The gathering of people is different when God's presence is there versus when God's presence is not there. And so, we need to be after God's presence more than his promises. So Moses said at the end of this, please show me your glory, he says to God. Moses was desperate for God's presence. Moses was desperate for God's presence. That was the thing he clinged to, and that was what was ultimately allowing him to remain faithful to God when the rest of Israel was worried about instant gratification, right? So they worshiped the calf. Moses is literally, remember, so the dark cloud comes, the thunder comes, all this stuff. Israel hits a step back 3. They say, Moses, you go, you handle this. So Moses goes up to the mountain. All of Israel was invited on top of the mountain, by the way. But only Moses went because everyone else was afraid. They distanced themselves. So he goes up and he receives the word of the Lord. He receives from God. He receives the 10 commandments up here. And when he comes back down, what are they doing? They're worshiping the golden calf. Because, God's taking too long. Moses is taking too long, all of this stuff. They didn't care about his presence. They cared about what they could get out of God. Moses was in God's presence, receiving his word, and guess what? He remained faithful. I can't help but think that some of you here tonight might not be seeing breakthrough in your life right now because you care more about getting something out of God than just having God. Israel turned to the golden calf, not because they stopped believing in Yahweh, right? They still believed he was there. They knew Moses was up there. They just said, Moses, you're taking too long, right? They didn't forget, didn't have short-term memory loss to forget all the amazing things that they had seen God do, the 10 plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, all these incredible feats. Like it'd be impossible to forget that. They didn't forget any of this stuff. No, they remembered that and they were grateful for it. They turned to the golden calf because God was taking too long. He wasn't giving them what they wanted in their flesh. They wanted this, that, and the other, and God was trying to get them to realize that he is what they should want. His presence is what they needed to be after. And that is why when Moses comes down from the mountain, what is the first commandment that God says? You shall have no other gods before me. We put so many things above the presence of God in our lives. Whether that's time, whether that's activities, whether that's people, whether that's sins, whatever it might be, we put all of these things, whether it's things that we want from God, whether it's blessings and gifts that we want from God, we put these things above God himself. He says, I'm the gift. And so you have to understand this. Catch this. Presence is greater than presence, okay? Presence, P-R-E-S-E-N-C-E, is greater than presence, P-R-E-S-E-N-T-S, okay? Presence is greater than presence. Moses knew this, and God wants you to know this.